It was formal in the way that institutional correspondence is formal when the institution is trying to appear measured while delivering something that is not measured at all. It came from the Office of Human Resources at Caldwell Meridian Group, the private equity firm where my husband Daniel had worked for 9 years. The subject line read, Formal Notice of Misconduct Investigation, Employee Reference, Daniel Osemensa. I read it once. Then I read it again more slowly, the way you read something when your first reading has produced a result your brain is not prepared to accept without verification. The notice stated that a formal complaint had been filed against Daniel alleging conduct unbecoming of a senior employee, specifically the misuse of confidential client data, and the improper direction of deal flow to a competing entity in which he held an undisclosed personal interest. It stated that an independent investigation had been commissioned. It stated that Daniel had been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation's outcome, and it stated in the final paragraph that the firm wished to notify his spouse as a matter of professional courtesy given the potential reputational and financial implications of the proceeding. I set the email down. I picked up my coffee. I looked out the window of the kitchen in our home in Buckhead, Atlanta, at the garden that was just beginning to come into its spring color, and I sat with what I had just read for approximately 4 minutes without moving. Then I called my attorney. My name is Adiz. I am 44 years old. I am the founder and managing director of Meridian Catalyst Partners, a private investment firm specializing in early-stage funding for financial services technology companies across the southeastern United States. I have been operating in the Atlanta private capital market for 16 years. I know this industry with the specificity of someone who built her position in it without inheritance, without a famous name, and without the particular advantages that accrue to people whose entry into capital markets is smoothed by prior relationships and institutional pedigree. I built what I have through a combination of technical competence, relationship cultivation conducted over years, and a capacity for due diligence that my colleagues on several occasions have described as almost unreasonable in its thoroughness. I tell you what I do for a living before I tell you anything else about this story because what I do is not incidental to what happened. It is the reason the story has the ending it has. And Daniel, my husband of 7 years, had apparently forgotten, in the specific way that people forget things about the people closest to them when familiarity has cured the novelty and routine has replaced attention, exactly what it was that I did all day in that office on Peachtree Street. He did not forget in the casual sense. He forgot in the complete sense. The kind of forgetting that allows a man to file a misconduct complaint against his wife's firm's portfolio company without recognizing that the capital structure of that company included prominently and documentably the investment vehicle that his wife managed. The kind of forgetting that allows a person to set a fire in a room without checking whether the person who owns the room is standing in it. He thought he was ending a professional situation he found inconvenient. He handed me a document that told me everything I needed to know about the full extent of what had been happening in our marriage and in his professional conduct for the preceding 2 years. Before I tell you the rest, I need to say this clearly. What follows is not a story about revenge. I want to establish that with the same precision I bring to an investment thesis because precision matters and because the narrative of the scorned woman seeking retaliation is both reductive and inaccurate. What follows is a story about a woman who read a document carefully, understood its full implications, and responded to those implications with the only tool she has ever found reliably useful: thorough, patient, completely documented accuracy. The outcome of that accuracy was not something I manufactured, it was something I allowed to arrive by refusing to obscure the facts. I need to tell you about Daniel first because Daniel before this story is as important as Daniel inside it, and because understanding who he was at his best is the only way to understand the full weight of what he chose to become. Daniel Osemensa was 47 years old when the email arrived. He was a managing director in the structured finance division at Caldwell Meridian Group, a position he had earned through 11 years of work that was, by any objective measure, genuinely excellent. He understood capital structure the way some people understand music, not as a technical exercise but as something with an inherent logic that when properly applied produced a result that was both correct and elegant. He was respected at the firm. He was respected in the industry. He was, until the 2 years preceding this story, someone I considered a genuine intellectual peer in a professional landscape where intellectual peers were not always easy to find. We met in 2013 at an industry conference in Charlotte, North Carolina, a panel discussion on alternative asset allocation strategies that I had been invited to join as one of 3 speakers, and that Daniel had attended as a participant. He asked a question from the floor during the open discussion period that was better than anything the moderator had managed to ask in 40 minutes of panel conversation. I made a note of his name. He found me during the networking reception afterward and said without preamble that he had disagreed with approximately 40% of what I had said on the panel and would like to explain why over dinner if I was available. I said I was available. We had dinner for 3 hours and disagreed about a great deal and found the disagreement, both of us, genuinely energizing in the way that good intellectual friction is energizing when you encounter it rarely enough to recognize its fact. We married in 2017 in a small ceremony in Savannah attended by immediate family and the handful of friends who occupied the innermost circle of each of our lives. We were both by then established professionals with independent careers, independent finances, and independent professional reputations that had been built over years before the other entered the picture. This independence was, for the first several years of the marriage, a genuine strength. We were two people who had chosen each other freely and specifically, who continued to choose each other with an awareness of what the choice involved, who brought to the shared life a quality of deliberateness that the absence of financial dependence made possible. I want to tell you about the professional landscape that surrounded us during those years because it is not background. It is the context in which everything that followed was seeded. Daniel worked at Caldwell Meridian Group, a firm I had professional relationships with but no financial entanglement with. My firm, Meridian Catalyst Partners, operated in adjacent but distinct territory. Early-stage fintech investment, primarily Series A and B rounds, with a portfolio that by 2017 included 14 active investments, and had produced 3 successful exits that had established my firm's reputation firmly enough that institutional capital sources were beginning to seek us out rather than requiring us to seek them. There was one area of potential overlap between Daniel's professional world and mine, and we had addressed it early in the marriage with the care that people who understand conflict of interest bring to the subject. Caldwell Meridian Group, as a structured finance operation, occasionally evaluated opportunities in the fintech space that could intersect with companies in my portfolio. We had established, with the guidance of both firms' legal teams, a clear protocol for managing that overlap, full disclosure to both institutions when a potential intersection was identified, recusal from any decision-making process where a conflict existed, and documentation of both the disclosure and the recusal on file at both firms. We had followed this protocol on 3 occasions in 6 years. It had worked cleanly each time. What I did not know until the email arrived on a Tuesday morning was that Daniel had, beginning approximately 2 years before that morning, been following a different protocol entirely. The full picture did not arrive with the email. It arrived in pieces over the 2 weeks following the email, assembled through a process of inquiry that I want to describe with some care because the process itself illustrates something important about how you respond when information of this significance becomes available to you. The first thing I did after calling my attorney, whose name is Priscilla Addo and who operates out of a firm in Midtown Atlanta with a practice that covers both family law and commercial litigation, was read the email again. All of it, including the attachments, which were 3 in number and which I had not initially opened because the primary notice had been sufficient to command the full range of my attention. The attachments were a summary of the misconduct allegations, a list of the specific transactions that had been flagged for investigation, and a disclosure notice indicating that the investigation had been commissioned by the firm's board of directors following a referral from an anonymous compliance report. I read the transaction list carefully, then I opened my firm's portfolio database on my laptop and I cross-referenced the transactions against my active investment positions. This took 11 minutes. What I found in those 11 minutes was that 2 of the 5 transactions flagged in the investigation summary involved companies that were portfolio holdings of Meridian Catalyst Partners, companies I had funded. Companies whose capital tables included my firm's investment vehicle as a named investor, companies that Daniel had been positioned in his professional capacity at Caldwell Meridian Group to evaluate for structured finance transactions and had apparently evaluated in ways that the firm's compliance function had determined warranted investigation. I sat with this for a long time. Not because I was uncertain about what it meant, but because I wanted to be entirely certain that I understood what it meant before I took any action or made any additional calls. What it meant was this. Daniel had, on at least 2 occasions that had been identified by the firm's compliance process, participated in the evaluation of transactions involving companies in which I had a material financial interest, without disclosing that interest to the firm as our established protocol required. He had not disclosed my investment position, he had not recused himself from the evaluation process, and he had, according to the allegations in the summary, directed deal flow in ways that benefited those companies' valuations in ways that were not consistent with the firm's standard underwriting criteria. This was a serious compliance failure. It was potentially a legal exposure. And it had been committed by a man who had sat at the kitchen table with me 4 times in the preceding 2 years, and listened to me discuss the portfolio companies in question as investments I was actively managing, whose progress I cared about, and whose valuations I had material financial reasons to want to see strengthened. I do not know, and I may never know with complete certainty, whether Daniel's direction of deal flow to those companies was a deliberate choice to benefit my portfolio or a genuine compartmentalization failure that allowed him to evaluate those transactions without consciously processing their connection to my professional interests. I have my own assessment. I have kept it largely private because my assessment is not the relevant actor in this situation. The relevant actor is the documentation, and the documentation said what it said. What I do know with complete certainty is that when the compliance report was filed, when the anonymous referral triggered the investigation, and when the formal misconduct proceeding was commissioned by the board, Daniel did not come to me. He did not call me. He did not sit at the kitchen table and say, "Adiz, there is a situation at work that involves your portfolio and I should have told you about it a long time ago." He engaged a private attorney. He prepared a formal defense, and as part of that defense he filed a counter-allegation with the firm asserting that the compliance irregularities had been the result not of his own conduct but of improper influence exerted by an outside party with a financial interest in the transactions in question. The outside party he named was not identified by name in the counter-allegation document which I obtained through Priscilla in the course of the legal process. The outside party was identified by role and relationship, a spouse with a material financial interest in affected portfolio companies who had access to privileged information about the firm's evaluation process through the marital relationship. The implication was clear. The target of the allegation was clear. I was the outside party Daniel had named as the source of the improper influence in his defense. My husband had reported me to his company for misconduct. He had done this without apparently pausing to consider that the company he was reporting me to was funded at the institutional level by a capital vehicle whose ultimate provenance I had reason to know considerably more about than Daniel had calculated. I want to tell you what I knew about Caldwell Meridian Group that Daniel did not know I knew, because this is the part of the story that requires the most careful and precise explanation, and because I want it to be understood correctly rather than sensationally. Caldwell Meridian Group had 14 months before the email arrived completed a significant recapitalization of its institutional investment base. This is not an unusual event in the life of a private equity firm. Capital bases turn over, institutional investors enter and exit positions. New capital sources are brought in as legacy investors redeploy elsewhere. What is specific to this instance is that the recapitalization had included the admission of a new anchor institutional investor whose capital had been structured through a fund of funds vehicle that, in turn, had as one of its named underlying investors a strategic capital partner of Meridian Catalyst Partners. I want to be exact about what this means and what it does not mean because the distinction matters legally and practically. It does not mean that I owned Caldwell Meridian Group or had any ownership interest in it. It does not mean that I controlled its operations or had any governance rights over its decisions. What it means is that there existed, in the capital structure of the firm that employed my husband and was now conducting a misconduct investigation partly directed at me, a traceable financial connection to a strategic partner of my firm. A connection that was documented, disclosed at the time of the recapitalization in the fund of funds investor materials, and entirely legitimate. But a connection that, when surfaced in the context of a misconduct proceeding in which I had been named as a respondent, would require the firm to examine with considerable care whether the investigation itself had been appropriately structured given the relationships involved. My attorney, Priscilla, recognized this immediately when I laid it out for her. She was quiet for approximately 6 seconds after I finished the explanation. Then she said, "Adiz, you need to understand that what you have just described is not a weapon. It is a fact, but it is a fact that changes the geometry of this proceeding substantially, and it needs to be placed in the record by someone who can present it with full accuracy and appropriate legal framing." I told her that was precisely why I had called her. She said she would need 3 days to prepare the initial documentation. I told her to take the time she needed and to do it correctly. 3 days later, Priscilla filed a formal response to the misconduct allegation on my behalf with Caldwell Meridian Group's board of directors. The response did 4 things. It addressed each specific allegation in the counter-complaint with documented factual rebuttal. It presented the full history of the conflict of interest protocol that Daniel and I had established at the outset of the marriage and the firm's legal team had reviewed and approved. It provided documentation demonstrating that every occasion on which that protocol had been properly invoked had been properly managed, and that the occasions identified in the investigation summary as compliance failures were occasions on which Daniel had not invoked the protocol at all. And it provided as a 4th element a full disclosure of the capital structure relationships between Caldwell Meridian Group's anchor institutional investor and Meridian Catalyst Partners' strategic capital base, with a formal request that the board consider whether the composition of the investigation committee required review in light of those relationships. The response was 47 pages. Priscilla had done in 3 days what most attorneys would have done in 3 weeks. I have known her for 9 years. She does not take longer than is necessary on anything, and she does not take less time than is required to do it correctly. I want to tell you about the 10 days between the filing of that response and the outcome of the proceeding because the 10 days are as important as the outcome itself, and because what happened in those 10 days required a quality of self-discipline that I want to account for honestly. Daniel and I were still living in the same house during those 10 days. I want to dwell on this for a moment because I think it is one of the more remarkable aspects of the entire situation, and because it speaks to something about both of us that I am still in the process of fully understanding. We were living in the same house. We were sharing a kitchen and a hallway and a routine that had been assembled over 7 years of shared life, and we were simultaneously on opposite sides of a formal legal proceeding that could, depending on its outcome, have significant consequences for both of our professional futures. We spoke to each other about logistics. We did not speak to each other about what was happening. The silence between us was the densest silence I have ever inhabited. It was not hostile. It was the silence of 2 people who had run out of the shared language that a marriage requires and were standing on either side of that exhaustion without knowing how to cross it. I was sleeping during those 10 days in the guest room, not because I had been asked to, but because the master bedroom was a room whose associations had become, for me, incompatible with the quality of rest I needed to think clearly. I needed to think clearly more than I needed to be comfortable. I slept in the guest room with my laptop on the nightstand and my legal pad on the small desk in the corner, and a very strong cup of ginger tea from Harney and Sons that I made every evening before I went to bed because it was the only part of my routine that felt entirely mine and entirely uncontaminated by the circumstances. I did not contact Daniel's family during those 10 days. I did not contact our mutual professional acquaintances. I did not speak to anyone outside of Priscilla's office about the substance of what was happening, and I asked the handful of people who knew something was wrong to respect that silence. I had learned from years of managing difficult investment situations that the period before an outcome is determined is the period most vulnerable to damage from premature communication. What you say before the facts are established becomes, in retrospect, either prescient or reckless, and the reckless version has a persistence in professional communities that no subsequent correction fully eliminates. There was one conversation I had during those 10 days that was not with my attorney and that I want to tell you about because it was the conversation that helped me hold the equilibrium I needed to get through the rest. I called my mother in Lagos on the 5th evening. My mother is 71 years old, a retired secondary school headmistress who ran a school of 900 students for 22 years with a combination of organizational precision and moral clarity that I have spent my entire adult life trying to approximate. She answered on the second ring. I told her in broad terms what was happening. She listened without interrupting, which is not her natural mode, which told me she understood the gravity. When I finished, she said in Igbo a phrase that translates approximately as, "The truth does not need a running start. It only needs a clear path." I wrote it down on my legal pad. I read it again before I went to sleep. The outcome of the proceeding arrived on the 11th day in the form of a formal communication from Caldwell Meridian Group's board of directors to both Daniel's attorney and Priscilla. The communication was precise and carefully worded in the way that institutional communications are precise and carefully worded when the institution has understood that it is in the presence of a situation with legal and reputational dimensions that require accuracy above all else. The board's communication stated the following. The misconduct investigation had been reviewed in light of the formal response filed on my behalf. The counter-allegation naming me as a source of improper influence had been examined against the documented history of the conflict of interest protocol established at the outset of the marriage. The board had concluded that the counter-allegation was not supported by the factual record. The documented history of the protocol demonstrated a consistent and properly managed compliance framework that had been adhered to on every occasion it had been formally invoked, and that the compliance failures identified in the investigation were attributable to failures to invoke the protocol on the part of the firm's employee, rather than to improper conduct by any outside party. The board further noted in a separate paragraph that the capital structure disclosure provided in my formal response had been reviewed by outside legal counsel, and that the board had determined, on the advice of that counsel, that the investigation committee composition had been appropriate. The disclosure had been reviewed as a matter of due diligence, and the board appreciated its provision. The formality of that appreciation was, to anyone familiar with how institutional boards communicate, something between an acknowledgement and a quiet reckoning with the fact that the person they had been nominally investigating had provided them, unprompted and with complete documentation, information about their own capital structure that the board itself had apparently not had occasion to examine with this degree of specificity. Daniel's employment at Caldwell Meridian Group was terminated, effective immediately, on the basis of the compliance failures documented in the investigation. The counter-allegation against me was formally withdrawn from the record. I will not tell you that I felt triumphant when Priscilla called to convey the outcome. I want to be accurate about what I felt because accuracy has been the consistent discipline of this entire account, and I am not going to abandon it at the conclusion. What I felt was the specific, exhausted relief of someone who has been holding the full weight of a very serious situation for 11 days without setting it down, and has finally been told that it is safe to put it on the table. Relief, and then beneath the relief, something that was not quite grief and not quite anger but occupied the same territory as both, the slow arrival of the full understanding of what the marriage had been and what it had not been and what the distance between those two things had cost. Daniel and I separated formally 3 weeks after the board's decision. The conversation that formalized the separation was not long. He was by then in possession of a complete understanding of what had happened, including the capital structure relationship he had not known about when he filed the counter-allegation. He said at one point in that conversation that he had not known. I told him I believed that, and I did believe it, and it did not change the fundamental accounting of what had occurred. He had filed an allegation against me to protect himself from a proceeding that had been triggered by his own conduct. The allegation had been incorrect. It had been filed without adequate investigation of the facts, and the facts, when examined with the thoroughness they deserved, had produced an outcome that reflected the record accurately. That is not something I did to him, that is something the record did because the record was what it was. The divorce proceedings were managed by Priscilla with the same thoroughness she had brought to the misconduct response. The financial separation of two independent professionals with distinct asset bases and clearly documented premarital financial histories was, in its legal mechanics, more straightforward than many divorces of comparable duration. The emotional dimension was not straightforward. It was not straightforward at all. I want to be honest about that because I think the professional composure I brought to the legal process can make it appear from the outside as though the emotional dimension was similarly managed. It was not. I was in therapy throughout and for a substantial period afterward with a clinical psychologist named Dr. Falik Ademi, whose practice is in Virginia Highland, and whose capacity for holding complexity without resolving it prematurely I found, in those months, to be the most valuable professional service I was receiving from anyone. What Dr. Ademi helped me understand, and what I want to share because I believe it has application beyond my specific circumstances, was something about the relationship between competence and trust. I am a person who trusts through verification. In my professional life, this is not only acceptable but expected. Due diligence is the mechanism by which trust is earned in the capital markets, and no serious investor deploys capital on the basis of impression alone. I had, however, deployed the currency of my marriage on the basis of impression to a degree that I had not fully examined. I had trusted Daniel not because I had verified the basis for that trust through the same quality of attention I brought to a series of term sheet, but because the emotional economy of a marriage is not supposed to require that quality of attention, and I had accepted that convention without applying the independent critical faculty that in every other domain of my life I treated as non-negotiable. Dr. Ademi did not suggest that I should have conducted due diligence on my husband as though he were a portfolio company. She helped me understand that there is a version of intimacy that does not require the suspension of discernment, that love and clear-eyed attention are not incompatible, and that the capacity for both simultaneously is not a failure of romance but a form of respect for yourself and for the person you have chosen. I am still learning what that looks like in practice. I expect it will be a long lesson. I am by disposition someone who does not mind long lessons if the subject matter is worth the time. I am 44 years old. I live in the house in Buckhead, which was mine before the marriage and remains mine after it, in a garden that came through the winter well and is showing the particular confidence of something that has been properly established. Meridian Catalyst Partners is in its strongest operating position in its 16-year history. The portfolio companies that appeared in the Misconduct investigation summary have continued to grow and have, in one case, progressed to a Series C round that has attracted institutional attention of a quality that validates the initial investment thesis with the specific satisfaction of being correct in a direction that required patience. I employ 23 people. I am building something that I understand completely from its foundation to its current form, because I built every part of it and have the documentation to show the sequence. There are things this experience clarified that I want to name directly because I think they are the actual content of what happened and the narrative of institutional proceedings and capital structure relationships, while factually necessary to the story, is not where the meaning lives. The first is about the relationship between professional identity and personal visibility. Daniel had stopped seeing my professional self with any degree of accuracy, not maliciously but completely. He had developed a relationship with the domestic person who shared his house that had entirely eclipsed his understanding of the professional person who managed a 16-year investment operation from an office on Peachtree Street. That eclipse was not sudden. It accumulated over years of dinners where the conversation turned to his work more reliably than mine, of weekends where the logistics of the household absorbed the time that might have been given to understanding each other's professional realities, of the ordinary domestic intimacy that, without deliberate maintenance, can gradually replace the professional respect that has to coexist with it for a marriage between equals to function as one. When he filed that counter-allegation, he was operating on a model of me that was 7 years out of date in the ways that mattered most to the situation. The professional person he had named as an outside party exerting improper influence was in his model a woman with some connections in the fintech investment space. The actual person he had named was the managing director of a firm with capital relationships that extended documentably into his own employer's institutional structure. He did not know that. He did not know it because he had stopped paying the kind of attention to my professional life that would have made it knowable. Let people see your work, all of it. The full professional dimension of who you are does not belong only in the office. It belongs in the marriage too, consistently and with accuracy, or the person who shares your life will eventually construct a model of you that fits their comfort rather than your reality. The second is about what documentation actually is. I have maintained meticulous professional records for 16 years because my industry requires it, and because my disposition demands it. The documented history of the conflict of interest protocol, the disclosed capital structure relationships, the compliance records of every properly invoked recusal over 6 years of marriage, these were not documents I had prepared in anticipation of this situation. They were documents that existed because documentation is the standard I hold myself to in every circumstance, favorable and unfavorable, consequential and routine. When the situation arrived in which those documents became the difference between an allegation that stood and an allegation that did not, they were available because they had always been maintained. Documentation is not a defensive act. It is the practice of people who understand that accuracy has value independent of any specific occasion on which it might be needed, and that occasions requiring accuracy arrive without announcement. Maintain your records, not because you are expecting to need them, because the moment they are needed, expecting them is too late. The third is about the specific form of patience that difficult situations require. The 10 days between the filing of Priscilla's response and the board's decision were 10 days in which I could not influence the outcome through any action available to me. The documentation had been submitted, the legal argument had been made, the facts were in the hands of the people who needed to assess them. What I could do in those 10 days was contaminate the outcome through premature action, through communications that established a record before the official record was closed, through responses to the situation that would have felt like agency but would have functioned as interference. I did not do those things. I made ginger tea, I called my mother. I went to my office every morning and managed my portfolio companies with the same attention I would have given them in any other 10-day period. The patience required was the patience of understanding that the work had been done and that the appropriate next action was to allow the work to produce its result. This is, in my experience, the most demanding kind of patience, the kind that requires you to remain still when everything in you wants to move, the kind that trusts the record to do what the record is capable of doing without your intervention. The fourth is about what the phrase outside party actually means. Daniel named me as an outside party in his defense. He meant it as a diminishment, an allocation of responsibility that removed him from the center of his own conduct by positioning me as an external force acting upon it. What he did not understand was that the term outside party, applied to me in the context of a firm in which my firm had a traceable capital relationship, was not a diminishment. It was an accurate description of a position with more structural significance than he had realized. He had intended to make me peripheral. He had in the documentation made me central in a way that required the board to examine its own capital architecture with a degree of attention it had not previously applied. The outside party he named was, it turned out, not outside at all. She was embedded through relationships she had built over 16 years of careful professional work, in the very structure of the institution that was supposed to be investigating her. He handed me a document. I read it carefully. The reading told me everything about what my careful work had actually built. You do not always know the full extent of what you have built until a situation arrives that requires its full extent to be known. The fifth and final clarification is about beginning. I am in the early stages of the life that comes after this one, and I want to be honest about what early stages feel like from the inside, because I think the stories we tell about recovery tend to compress the timeline in ways that do the actual experience a disservice. The early stages feel like standing in a room where the furniture has been removed and the proportions are unfamiliar. Not unpleasant exactly, and not without the particular possibility that an empty room contains, but requiring a quality of navigation by reference to walls and foundations rather than the familiar landmarks of an established arrangement. I am navigating that room. I am in it fully and with my eyes open. Dr. Adami is a reliable presence in that navigation. The work is a reliable presence. The garden is, in its particular wordless way, a reliable presence. I know what I have built. I know the full extent of it now more completely than I knew it before a Tuesday morning email required me to see it all at once. I know what 16 years of careful, documented, thoroughly maintained professional work looks like when its full record is placed in front of people who need to understand it. I know what the truth does not need. It does not need a running start, it only needs a clear path. My mother was right about that, as she has been right about most things that have mattered over the course of my life. The path was clear, the documentation made it so. Everything that followed was simply the record doing what a well-maintained record does when it is finally given the room to speak. That has always been enough. I have always known it was enough. It was simply on a Tuesday morning at 7:43 required to demonstrate it to an audience larger than myself. That is fine, I was prepared. I am always prepared. That is the work. That is all the work has ever been.